I grew up in Cuba, and I never thought that Cuba would become a communist country. Many people at that time warned the Cuban that what was going on was a communist takeover, but we say no, that won't happen here. No one even dreamed that. And I see it, the same thing repeating here in the United States now. And I feel very uncomfortable about because I know what is the end of it. And I know that after a while, there will be absolutely nothing that the American people will be able to do. And they will lose everything they own, everything they know. And don't even think that you will be even safe inside your own house, because you won't be. They will come and get you wherever you are. They will take your arms. They will take everything, and your way of life, everything. And you will be just a pawn of the state.
You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay, there is a point beyond which they must not advance.
And this is the point I think Americans need to comprehend. If America goes down economically, it will go down militarily. If America goes down militarily, we all go down. The free world is finished, and it will be finished for a very, very long time.
Everything, practically, is in a self-destructive mode.
We're in the most critical period we've been since the Revolutionary War.
You're not alert, you're not awake with what's happening.
They would just as soon see this country on its knees and everything equalized.
That concept of collectivism, big government, is a magnet for the predator class.
The plans for all of this are to have everything globally in place by 2020.
If we're that dumb and we allow this to happen, we deserve everything we're going to get, because we're going to get it right in the neck.
We're headed into what could be a nightmare that would make all the atrocities of the 20th century look like they were a dress rehearsal.
When people are afraid, they ask government to do more, not less.
Their theories are designed to scare the people to believe there's a crisis when there is not a crisis at all. There's no crisis.
I think we're losing more and more freedom because we are afraid.
The left wants you to believe that catastrophe is always just around the corner. And the only way to avoid it is to do exactly what they say. But this film will show everything they do is just a Trojan horse of deceit, carefully crafted to advance their real agenda of finishing America off.
We have been the main stumbling block to world communism since it first raised its ugly head.
From the promotion of Islam to the propaganda of climate change, from the deceit of Common Core to the manufactured economic crisis, and from their manipulation of the evangelical church to the unsustainable debt burden. This film will show the issues are simply being used as a smokescreen to hide the purposeful, premeditated, treasonous attacks on the foundations of our freedom.
The world religion has just purged us from being able to determine right from wrong.
You know what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said about Russia? How the communists took over Russia? He said, we forgot God.
Their stated agenda, carved in stone on a monument in Georgia and outlined in documents placed in the Ark of Hope, is to eliminate 6.5 billion people by century's end. And they will succeed if we don't stop them.
This is not just a fight for the United States of America. This is a fight for civilization itself.
It's everything Karl Marx dreamed of before our very eyes.
I think they've pushed us over the cliff in ever since. America isn't going to fall. We are falling.
In 2007, I was a state representative, and I had no idea the things I would discover about why America was collapsing from within would motivate me to take my life savings and make a film. And I had never made a film before. During the 2 years it took to finish the project, my children prayed daily that it would win the largest single cash prize film festival in America, which in my thinking was a mighty tall order. But of course, it wasn't for God.
The 2010 $101,000 grand prize for Best of Festival goes to Agenda!
God is so good. I'd like to thank him for just the wonderful wife he gave me. I don't think any man can even reach a fraction of his potential if he doesn't have the woman with him that God intended him to have for life. And I want to thank her. Kids, I'm giving this to you so you'll always remember God does answer prayers. Thank you so much.
After the festival, Agenda began to spread throughout the country. Millions of people were watching it. We had an average of 1,000 different independent showings every single week for 2.5 years. And as we traveled, people all over just seemed overwhelmed. The people I spoke to felt they were under attack from 100 different enemies with 100 different agendas. But I knew from my research that wasn't the case. If things are always moving in one direction in a unified fashion, there is a reason why. Consistency has never been a virtue of ignorance. An experience we had along the way finally put into place a missing piece of the puzzle. We had a Tea Party group that met monthly at a local community college in Minnesota. We showed the film Agenda, and then afterward, as I was answering questions, a man stood up. He said, "I want to congratulate you on your research and how you found all the socialist, communist influences that have changed America. My hat's off to you." I said, "Thank you, sir." But then he stopped, and I could tell something was coming. He said, "I want to tell you something. I'm a professor at this college. I am a communist, and we will win because we're taking all your children." And then he walked out. A woman in the front row who was crying said, "How could he be at our little community college?" I said, "Ma'am, he is at every school in America. Even though many are starting to wake up, they're studying the issues, they're reading books, they care about this country. They didn't know the most fundamental thing you have to know to ever win a battle of subversion. Your enemy." One of the radical Marxist leaders of the 1960s, I think, gave us the key that we are facing today. He said, "The issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. These masters of deceit have used their propaganda so successfully, they've actually accomplished the greatest feat in warfare. They have convinced us they no longer exist, which has given them carte blanche to subvert, manipulate, deceive, infiltrate, and undermine us with no resistance whatsoever. I realized we didn't understand our enemy at all. Their strategy or tactics, their strengths or weaknesses. My work wasn't finished. There was still so much that people didn't understand about the things they have done and are doing to use the issues against us as tools to destroy. "2,500 years ago, in his masterpiece, The Art of War, Sun Tzu wrote, "If you know yourself, you will win the battle 50% of the time. If you know your enemy, you will win 50% of the time. But if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you will win 100% of the time."
If you don't know who we are as a nation, you don't know our identity, you don't know our history, you don't really understand the price that's been paid for America, then anybody can lead you astray.
Once we understand who we are, it will be easy to identify our enemies by those that are attacking the foundations we stand upon. So before the last 100 years of subversion, who were we? What made America the greatest country of all time? God established 3 institutions: the family, the church, and the state. And He told us exactly what their authority was to be and what was within their jurisdictions. America's greatness was that we followed God's instruction on how those institutions should be run. All 3 were created by God to protect each individual person from being abused by the collective. Every attack against us today is aimed at destroying those distinctions. It's interesting to note the Communist Manifesto states the communist goal is to destroy the family, the church, and the state, all 3 of God's institutions. So regardless of how well-intentioned, the enemies of America are all the people and groups that seek to transfer the authority God gave the family and church to the state. And they are collectivists.
Collectivism is a broad ideology that includes all of these things like communism, fascism, Nazism, socialism, left-wingism, liberalism. All of these different words are used to describe different flavors of collectivism. And collectivism is the concept that the state is all-important and that the individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number.
Unfortunately, the end of all collectivist schemes is a government that takes care of its citizens from the cradle to the grave, and that is Marxism. The people that don't understand this naively believe you can have big government without totalitarian methods, and history has shown us you cannot.
From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That was the grand ideal, right? But the problem has always been no one steps down. Once you have the power, no one steps down. And the reality is that beautiful picture was just a picture. It was a fiction. No one ever intended on stepping down.
Therefore, that's the reason, no matter what government you go to, whether it's the national government in Washington, D.C., or you go down to your city hall some Thursday night and take a look of who are those people sitting up there in those big chairs, you know, while the little people come in and say, well, I'd like to complain about this. And they say, your time is up, you know. Who are those people in the city hall? They're collectivists, every one of them. They're enjoying this power. They've been drawn to that power. They're predators.
Big government will never work because no one is capable of being in charge. We like to think of Hitler and Stalin as if they were uniquely evil people. But the simple truth is, every single person on the planet would have done the exact same things they did if they believed their philosophies and weren't accountable to any higher authority. Ideas have consequences. What you believe affects what you will do. They weren't uniquely evil. They were sinful men like the rest of us, but they had exceptionally bad ideas, the same ones we are playing with today.
America was based on the opposite concept of individualism, was that the purpose of the state was not to govern the individual, but to protect the individual. The individual was supreme, and the state was the servant of the individual.
In America, valuing each person, this is biblical. This comes from Christianity. You go to communist countries or Islamic countries, life is not valuable. You know, you kill, so what?
You can put it in whatever package you want, but the facts are, the mantra of our age being accepted worldwide is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And that is communism.
It's not the case that the Cold War is over, or to put it another way, it's not the case that the West has won the Cold War. The Cold War was not a military confrontation between two military alliances. It was a war of ideologies. It was a war of utopian totalitarian socialism versus democracy, market economy, freedom.
I interviewed a New Zealander some years ago who infiltrated the New Zealand Communist Party and was sent to the Soviet Union to train at Lenin's Institute for Higher Learning in 1983. This was the school for communists from all over the world, 6,000 students at any one time, some of them on 7-year courses. They were taught there was going to be a massive opening to the West, that the communists did much better in times of détente than they did of conflict. So they were going to open up to the West, they were going to downplay communism, they were going to change their system.
One of the tenets laid down by Lenin was that you have to pretend to be defeated. Communism, as they say, or Leninism is the better word, has gone back and forth through this friendly mode, enemy mode many times throughout history. And this is just to lure the opposition into a feeling of false security.
The way you finish ideological wars, the way you destroy an ideology, and we have historical precedent for that. That happened with the Nazis. We should have had the Cold War over 20 years ago, yes, but for that we would need a Nuremberg-style trial of communism, all the crimes exposed, all the archives opened, the judgment of history passed. That didn't happen.
Now you've got to realize, when Nazi Germany was defeated in World War II, the Americans went in there and denazified the country. Anybody who was a Nazi was taken out of positions of power, totally changed the whole political climate. Russia was never de-KGB'd. The KGB was left in place, and now it is stronger than it ever was before. And you see their puppet, Mr. Putin, attempting to reinstitute the Soviet Empire now.
They may have changed their name. They took their hat, which said Communist Commissar across the top. They turned it around, and now it says entrepreneur or capitalist or social democrat or something. But it's the same hat on the same heads of the same Leninists.
Trial of communism should have finished that. It didn't happen, and therefore we are not out of that crisis. And that is the reason why we have Putin. That is the reason why you have Obama. It is still going on. The Cold War is going on. It's going on the streets of Moscow now. It's going on the streets of Tehran. It's going on really in America as well.
Let me give you, if I might, an example. They have a particular program they want to implement, and they go in and they ask for everything. They ask for everything, and they're aggressive about it. They push ahead. And so they push until they get opposition, starts to build up against it. And at that given moment, they evaluate the opposition. They say, Well, is there any strength to it? Will it last? Will we be able to endure it? Or do we push ahead even farther? If the movement grows up to where it can do them harm, they then back off and say, well, maybe we don't want it all. Let's compromise a little. Let us get along together now, because I'm willing to give up what I've asked for totally for just a bit of it. Aren't you willing to give up a bit that we can work together? Next thing you know, another month goes by, another year, and here they come again.
They'll just incrementally get what they want. Now, the classic example is Obamacare. Now, that was designed 100% by Democratic Socialists of America, Marxist group. They pushed it on America through Quentin Young, their member, who was the mentor of your president, Mr. Obama. But more than that, Quentin Young was a 40-year veteran of the Communist Party USA. So they got the first steps. The Affordable Health Care Act pushed through in 2009. It wasn't single-payer health care. It wasn't 100% socialised health care, which is what they're after, but they got as much as they could get. Now, if you read their publications, they are boasting it's going to fail. It's not going to do the job. It's going to let people down. But that's great, because then they're going to blame the greedy insurance companies and the nasty doctors, and then they're going to push full on for single-payer health care. They're using the dialectic, they're using Lenin, they're using Hegel. Get what you can get, reach a compromise, then when the opposition backs off, then you go forward for the next step. And you just keep on doing that and doing that and doing that till you get what you want.
That strategy is what they use on every issue, every time. We will see a single-payer system implemented by our government in the near future. As Obamacare collapses, as it was designed to, they will step up to fix the problem of high premiums and a disgruntled people with more government. We never seem to learn. We keep compromising, keep giving up ground, and keep playing strictly defense, which is why we always lose.
We are in a dependent state, and when you go to the voting booth, you get to vote your self-interest. So, real issue, a real concern when you don't have a voting base with some skin in the game, as much to lose as to gain. What we know from history is that when you tip the scale at 51%, now you are talking about a license to steal. You're talking about that 51% tyranny that de Tocqueville was so concerned about. The democracy, for all its benefits, the main challenge is you get to the point where you have a 51% tyranny.
I think that it's underappreciated in our society just how extensive the damage of the welfare state is. And I think that when you look into the heart of the liberal and what they do to our society in the name of social justice or in the name of equality, it's evil will.
When a government is working as hard as possible to create dependency in their citizens, you know that their real aim is to eliminate freedom, because no man is truly free that is unable to provide for himself.
The dollar in America today, it takes 98 of them to buy what $1 did in 1913 when the Federal Reserve System was enacted into law. That is theft.
The fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto is to create a central bank. Ours was created in 1913 and is called the Federal Reserve.
You say Federal Reserve, and I think most Americans think that's part of the government. But of course, the Federal Reserve Bank isn't part of the government. The Federal Reserve is a private bank.
It's not a government institution. It's as Federal Express.
I'm sure the individuals involved would fit nicely into my chart if we knew their names, but we have allowed them to remain anonymous. They also tell us we do not have the authority to audit them to see how much of our money they have printed, even though with each bill they print, inflation soars. At the current rate of inflation, which most think is very modest, things go up in price 10 times every 50 years. My grandfather bought a nice house in 1915 for $4,500. My father bought a nice house in 1965 for $45,000. And my house today is $450,000. So if the rates of inflation just stay like they are, my grandson's house will cost him $4.5 million, and his grandson's $45 million.
Inflation is a tax. It's a hidden tax. And so it steals from people who have saved. When they finally retire at the end of a lifespan, all this money that they put aside doesn't buy anything anymore.
Houses haven't gotten more expensive. The dollar has just lost 97% of its value over the last 100 years. 1 ounce of gold would buy 300 loaves of bread 2,000 years ago, and an ounce of gold today will buy 300 loaves of bread. Prices rarely change. What's happened is the Federal Reserve has been quietly stealing our wealth while we believe their lie that inflation is normal. It wasn't normal for the first 6,000 years of Earth history. It magically started in America in 1913. Our economic system today is based on Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes is the father of it. If there is any doubt to the purposefulness of our economic situation, listen to this. He said, quote, "By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens." Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch its currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and it does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose, unquote. The second plank of the Communist Manifesto is to implement a graduated income tax. Ours was placed into law in 1914.
If you establish a tax that is based on the government's power to determine what percentage of your income it's going to take away from you, how much of your income does it control? Well, that means the government controls 100% of your income. If that is the situation, you are no longer a free person. You are a slave, and you live on an allowance from your government.
When Ronald Reagan came into office, the top tax rate was 70%. When he left office, he had cut it down to 27%. During that same time, revenue to the government doubled. The lie of the left is that increasing taxes on the rich will help stimulate the economy, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's all a strategic part of the plan to create more dependency. People wonder why our free enterprise system isn't working anymore. It's because the inflation, taxation, and regulation is effectively killing its productivity and its ability to create wealth. So now people talk about redistributing the wealth we have instead of creating more. Every single person in the world could be a millionaire. Wealth is created by hard work, creativity, and ingenuity. The lie that it's a fixed pie is perpetrated by those that seek to pit the have-nots against the haves. If you add up all the debts and obligations our government has placed on us, every single individual owes over $650,000, which obviously isn't ever going to be paid back.
That's the nature of bankruptcy. And as one writer used to say, how did you go bankrupt? Well, very slowly and then all at once.
God said, "The borrower is servant to the lender." Artificially low interest rates have encouraged everyone to be buried in debt and enslaved to the banks. When you penalize productivity and reward sloth, you know exactly what you are doing. You are making us poorer as a nation, which will create more dependency, but of course, the cycle of history doesn't stop there.
And then you find that deterioration, that move towards dictatorship, which is the stage that follows dependency, where the vast majority of people are dependent on the state, and the only way to continue to deliver what the vast majority of people expect is via the strong arm of government.
If you look at how do you change society, well, one of the things you obviously do is you go after the next generation. And you do that through the education system, and that's exactly what has happened to us. The Marxist movement in America has done exactly that.
The education system establishes the direction for the future. It sets the hearts and the minds, the perspectives of the next generation. Everybody knows how important it is.
They know that if they can get control of our children and they can pump their ideology into these young, hungry brains, they virtually can have them captive as prisoners for life.
And you're doing it all under the banner of being internationally competitive, or college ready, or career ready. So the euphemisms hide the actual intent.
The father of global education, Robert Mueller, was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and the creator of the World Core Curriculum. He said the goal was, quote, to promote growth of the group idea so that group good, group understanding, group interrelations, and group goodwill will lead to group consciousness, unquote. His World Core Curriculum was pushed in America by George Bush Sr. as America 2000, which was renamed by Bill Clinton Goals 2000, which was then given a facelift to become George Bush Jr.'s No Child Left Behind, which was the driving force behind Barack Obama's Common Core. It's all the same thing, Republican or Democrat, progressing down the same road of complete brainwashing. Since John Dewey, the entire focus of education by the elites has been to, as quickly as possible, move the children to a collectivist mindset. The 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto states, provide a free education by the state for all children and to combine education with industrial production. Bill Gates has teamed up with the United Nations to build the model that will have our schools simply be a tax-paid training ground for corporate America.
In the end, most of this tracks back to people who would benefit financially from a more government-centric economy because they're at table. They're already political players. They don't want to worry about competition.
Not only is competition eliminated, but employees are created. The type that would be content to work 60 or 70 hours a week in a dead-end corporate job that just paid enough to survive. Traditionally, Americans would have had no interest in that. They would have wanted to use all the individual talents and abilities that God had given them. They wanted to do 100 different things in their life. Invent things, start new businesses, change the world. And the elites didn't want any of that, so it had to be destroyed.
It's like we're going after Marx's vision and at the same time making it impossible as well, because the mind arson necessary to get an amenable voter means that the wealth that you're planning on redistributing is really gone. You just don't know it yet.
Just as I was beginning to dig in, I realized I was making a big mistake. The temptation on all these different issues is to not accept the reality of how things really are. The bottom line is, our enemies are in control of the schools, so there is no fix. I know you don't want to hear that because I don't want to hear that, but it's true. They want our kids to be useful idiots. They want them to be dependent on the state. That's the goal of the whole thing. So they will repackage, rename, rebrand the same old thing over and over again. It is intentionally going downhill. We have to grasp this. It is purposeful. We legitimize them by acting like they just don't have a good idea and we have a better one. They know exactly what they are doing. They want to create a new world man that is dependent on government for his very existence. So to even talk about Common Core, debating its good points or bad points, is playing into their plan of sidetracking all of our energies and efforts on a dead-end road. Even without Common Core, the schools are completely bankrupt and destroying our children. We have seen a decline now for 70 straight years without any interruption. As long as the government has a monopoly in education, we will keep getting what we have.
And the end result is to make our children and those educated under this influence, to make them unfit to govern themselves.
We wonder why it's hard to get a good candidate anymore for President of the United States. Well, let me show you how education affects politics. In 1980, there were approximately 40% of Americans that were conservative, 10% liberal, and 50% undecided. And since even our numbers show that they are capturing 85% of our young people each year through the educational system, this is how it plays out. In 2012, America was divided at 30% conservative and 30% liberal, with 40% undecided. By 2028, it will be 20% conservative, 50% liberal, and 30% undecided. And by 2036, only 20 years from now, it will be 10% conservative, 70% liberal, and 20% undecided. This is simply demographics, and there is no quick fix to change this. 2016 is the last election in my lifetime where it will even be possible to get an actual conservative elected.
On September the 11th, 2001, when the word came through that the World Trade Center had been hit, Muslims poured out the mosque screaming, Allah Akbar! And they ripped a pregnant Christian girl to pieces, and they went on to kill 9,000 Christians that day in Jos. 9,000 Christians were slaughtered in Jos, Nigeria on September the 11th, 2001. Did your newspapers report that?
We have delegated to the UN the right to pick the people who are going to be brought to the United States for refuge.
And we keep opening our doors and allowing more in, and that's going to be it's a nightmare that's waiting to happen.
And what they have done, virtually without exception, is they have selected Muslims to be refugees to America.
It's like taking a loan from the mafia. You'll pay all right, and you'll pay in spades.
Of course, I was born into it. I was raised into it. I lived. So I've experienced Islam in every area of my life. Islam is mandated to take over the world by force. It's commanded. They may deny it, but it's in the Quran.
Think about this. Islam doesn't believe in women's rights. It's fine for a husband to beat his wife. There's no freedom of speech. Any who disagree are executed. Homosexuals are stoned to death. Pornography and alcohol are punished with a beating. And yet the left loves their system, one that stands against everything they claim to support. I think this proves beyond a shadow of a doubt the left will support anything and use any people group if they think it will help destroy their two greatest enemies, Christianity and freedom. They no more care about Muslims, the poor, women, blacks, the environment, or the children than they do about an unborn baby's right to life, a Christian's right to free speech, or a balanced budget. It is all a lie, 180 degrees opposite of the truth.
Only 16% of Islam is a religion. The rest of it is a legal system, a geopolitical system, a military system, a dress code, a moral code. It's a lot of other things, but it's not a religion.
How come countries like Iran, when Islam is implemented, there's so much brutality against your own people? Why there is no peace? Why there is fear? That's what an Islamic country is like.
Those people who say that Islam is a peaceful and tolerant religion, if the most violent and intolerant religion in history can be called peaceful and tolerant, what do we call the Amish and the Mennonites?
It is well documented certain fact that international terrorism was invented by the Soviets in the first place. I mean, you can't argue against this. Seeing all the documents, they were training, financing, arming all the terrorists. Originally, those were left-wing terrorists called normally liberation fronts, liberation movements, these kind of things. That was the plan of Yuri Andropov.
In 1972, Ion Pacepa, who was head of the Romanian KGB, who later defected to the United States, he had a meeting with Andropov, the head of the Soviet KGB, where they organized the sending of 4,000 Soviet agents into the Islamic world to stir up hatred against Israel and the United States.
So the communists saw another wedge opportunity there, another way to divide and conquer, another way to build armies of opponents to their main enemy, which is the United States.
We know that the Marxists were infiltrating the American Christian churches 80, 90 years ago, getting into the seminaries. Would you not think they were also infiltrating the Islamic seminaries in the Middle East?
They realized these people have the same goal of world domination. Let's infiltrate and become the leaders, and then use these people to accomplish our goal.
Most of those people think they're fighting for Allah. They don't have any idea they're fighting for communism.
The AK-47 seems to be a symbol of the Muslim terrorists. They didn't invent or design or produce the AK-47. It was provided to them by the Soviets. In fact, all the weaponry, whether you're thinking of the MiGs they're flying or the high-end helicopter gunships that they're strafing and machine gunning our missionaries and teams with in Sudan, it all comes from the Soviet bloc and from Red China.
The Soviets established and set up and ran the Palestine Liberation Organization. Today, the Taliban in Afghanistan is as much Maoist as it is Muslim.
A few years ago, in 2006, Pavel's mentor, Alexander Litvinenko, a Russian KGB agent who had defected to the West, was poisoned by Putin with radioactive plutonium-210. He revealed before he died in London that the terrorist attacks against Russia had been done by the KGB, so they could blame it on Muslim terrorists to make it look like they were opposed to radical Islam too. He also revealed before he died that the #1 man in Al-Qaeda right now was trained by the KGB.
And it is a fact that he's a Russian agent. The real reason why Alexander was the first target for assassinations was precisely because he was talking about the connection between Moscow and Islamic terrorism.
Stanislav Lunev was the former deputy head of Russian military intelligence. He said to a friend of mine, if radical Islamists ever let off an atomic bomb in an American city, don't believe it. It will be us. It will be the Russians using radical Islam as a cover.
If you study modern-day terrorism, you will realize immediately the leaders of Islam are in it for the same reason the communist leaders are communist, for power and control. Islamic leaders aren't blowing themselves up for the cause any more than communist leaders are voluntarily sharing the obscene wealth they have stolen from the working class. Communism and Islam are twins.
Even people in the government, most of them Their goal is not Islam. The goal is to keep the power at any cost.
You might say that when they win, that the communists and the Islamists will fight amongst themselves over our bodies, and maybe that will happen. But that's a little bit too late for us, isn't it?
Missionaries were being machine gunned on the roads. Red Cross ambulance workers were being killed. And what was absolutely scandalous is this was not only being funded by the Soviet Union and Red China, but by the World Council of Churches. The World Council of Churches was taking money from members in National Council of Churches in America and across Europe and putting that into what was called the Program to Combat Racism. Nice name, but it was funding terrorism, and they were murdering missionaries, and that's what we were fighting against.
The World Council of Churches used to be known as the Communist Party at prayer. It's a centralised body basically controlled once by the Soviet Union and now dominated by the Russians through the Russian Orthodox Church, which is totally controlled by the KGB, has been for years. Do you think in Russia, under Stalin, he revived the Russian Orthodox Church? Do you think he would have revived the Russian Orthodox Church had he not controlled it? Had he, this is an avowed atheist, living in an atheist system dedicated to the destruction of religion, but they revived the Russian Orthodox Church because they knew they could use it as a tool under KGB direction to influence other churches all over the world.
What I see is that the church has become an enemy of God, because it has been infiltrated with people that have degrees from elite institutions. And these are people that, they have come into the church, but they never were believers. There are some professors in divinity schools and seminaries that take delight in destroying the faith of innocent young people.
Christianity has always been the main target because they knew with a strong Christian church, their plans of a one-world government that requires a one-world religion to succeed would never be possible.
And I think that's why Christianity is a religion that people intent on despotism don't want around. The surest sign that the elites in our society are up to no good, just as the founders of our country predicted they would be, by the way, is that they're trying to get rid of Christianity. Because Christianity is what encourages people, emboldens people who live according to good conscience, acknowledging God, to stand firm in the right.
Step one was to remove God's word, the absolute authority and standard of the church.
It's as if the uncomfortable things that hold us accountable have slowly been scrubbed from the message from the pulpit. What was sin 2,000 years ago is sin today. And that's a message I think we need to hear quite often from the pulpit, and I don't hear it that much.
Research shows the majority of Americans don't believe anymore that the Bible is God's word. But a more amazing testimony to the left's success is the vast majority of seminaries in America don't either.
They realize that if you can influence churches, you can influence millions of people. So a lot of these people have had an end game in view, and part of the end game is seeking to enlist the church as pawns in their game.
Step two was to force real Christianity inside the four walls of the church, while sidetracking those that were just religious with do-gooder causes.
We Christians in the West, we are not even aware how much oppression we have in the U.S. We are persecuted without knowing it. They have told us, Christians, you can't do this. And said, yes, sir, we won't. You can't do, witness at your work. Okay, yeah, I won't. You can't talk against sin. Okay, sir, we won't do it. And so gradually, we Christians, what they allow us to do, okay, you can gather in your churches on Sunday, worship the best you can, and then go home. And we have accepted that type of Christianity. We have accepted that we should not and we cannot influence our society or the government. We have accepted those limitations that the enemy has put on us. And we have withdrawn into ourselves without even realizing it.
Something that is obscene is something that shouldn't be brought into public. When are Americans, particularly people of faith, going to realize that over the course of the last 60, 70 years in our country, we have allowed them to redefine the world so that Jesus is obscene, so that God is obscene, the Ten Commandments are obscene, kids wearing a t-shirt that says Jesus saved, kicked out of school, people wearing an F word all over their clothing, they can wander around.
As I dug in to find out how this had happened, I came across testimony from the Congressional Record in 1953. Manning Johnson, who was a top communist official, testified. He said, quote, "The communists discovered that the destruction of religion could proceed much faster through infiltration of the church. It was determined that with only small forces available, it would be necessary to concentrate communist agents in seminaries and divinity schools. These institutions would make it possible for a small communist minority to influence the ideology of future clergymen. The idea was to divert the emphasis from the spiritual to the material," unquote. The testimony continued with Benjamin Gitlow, who was one of the founders of the Communist Party USA. Quote, "The Methodist Federation for Social Action was first organized by Dr. Harry Ward. Its objective was to transform the Methodist Church and Christianity into an instrument for the achievement of socialism," unquote. Dr. Harry Ward was not only a communist, he was also a member of the Fabian Socialist Society. His good friend and fellow Fabian was Dr. Walter Rosenbusch, and unbelievably, those two men started what is today the National Council of Churches.
Unfortunately, most Christians these days are tragically biblically illiterate and are accepting anything that comes down the pike that has the name Jesus stamped upon it, but it's not the agenda of the Jesus of the Bible. It's basically a satanic agenda which is seeking to displace Jesus and exalt the worship of man and creation over the Creator.
The communist goal was to turn their number one enemy, the Christian church, into their greatest asset. That monumental task is almost complete. They are turning the evangelical church into a counterfeit that worships a false God, one they have created that is only love, with a false gospel, a do-gooder works salvation instead of Christ alone, and a false mission, saving the planet instead of fulfilling the Great Commission.
You go back to the fall of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, if you were from that side of things, from the communist side of things, you're looking at the world, and there's only one superpower left, and it's the United States of America. It is the only nation on earth that is built on the ideals of limited government, free enterprise, individual liberty, private property rights. So now you've got this one superpower that is completely opposed to everything you believe in. What do? Well, the word came down to harmonize the United States into the rest of the world. You know, what would get us to do that? What would get us to throw our liberties on the bonfire like a good old-fashioned book burning? Environmental Armageddon became the choice. You've got to save the planet. And that became the mantra. And Americans bought it hook, line, and sinker. The environmental movement became the most popular movement in the country, and people were willing to be led in any direction if it meant protecting the environment. And that's pretty much how we got there.
We have to do something, they say, because we're destroying the planet, the Earth has a fever, we have to do something. And that, if it were true, would be a legitimate argument, right? But if you're screaming fire in a crowded theater, then it's a wicked argument to make when there's no fire at all. You're just trying to move people.
There are three core claims that are propping up the entire movement.
In Michigan, they've done some wonderful studies at the university level, illustrating the fact that when you increase carbon dioxide plant life grows wildly.
If you Google optimum CO2 concentration for plant growth, those plants, which all life depends on as their food source, you will find that it is 4 times the present level.
You can go back to the era here on planet Earth. Levels of carbon dioxide were probably 6 to maybe 12 times higher than today.
We're not at a high point now. We're at a low point.
Foliage was all over the planet.
Carbon pollution is now a common term that people are using, when in fact, if CO2 fell below 150 parts per million in the global atmosphere, all the plants would die. And then what would we eat? There wouldn't be anything left to eat but rocks at that point. Frost and ice are the enemy of life. You come from the tropics into the temperate zone and then the Arctic, you lose 99% of species biodiversity.
Which means that quite the opposite of what the alarmists say, global warming won't lead to more extinctions. It will lead to protecting more species from extinctions.
Over 115 different countries and territories are dying off by not having the 2.1 children per woman that is necessary for a country to survive. Population has increased in recent years because of modern medicine, and our environment has become so much cleaner. The world could easily handle 100 billion people, but it will never even reach 10 billion. As soon as this generation of elderly start dying off, population will decline for as far as the demographer's eye can see.
You know, you could move the entire population of the globe to the state of Texas, use 1/3 of it for living space, 1/3 for factories and workplaces, and another 1/3 for recreation, and you could leave the entire rest of the world completely uninhabited.
You don't have to dig very deep into the key people and groups involved for it to become crystal clear why they continue to promote these lies.
Karl Marx really got the entire modern environmental movement rolling. It's well documented. In fact, you can go back to 1883, a paper that was written by Frederick Engels and Karl Marx, Dialectics of Nature. They talk about global cooling. They were trying to scare people into believing that mankind's pollution was going to put the Earth into a free fall temperature-wise, and there would be no life whatsoever. Ray Lancaster studies at the feet of Karl Marx and comes up with a saying that is really, I mean, it's at the heart of the environmental movement today. Humans are the insurgent sons of nature. Interestingly, Ray Lancaster had a disciple who was named Arthur Tainsley. Arthur Tainsley coined the term ecology. The word ecology was essentially fashioned by a disciple of Karl Marx.
And it keeps going. Earth Day is celebrated on April 22nd each year because that was Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union's birthday. And Gus Hall, who wrote the book Ecology that helped get the movement rolling, was the head of the Communist Party USA.
The modern engine of the environmental movement is the United Nations.
You have to remember, the United Nations Charter was written by Alger Hiss, one of the most notorious Soviet spies working in the FDR administration. People don't know that.
When my friend was training in Moscow, the Soviets were openly telling all of their students from all over the world, the United Nations is our thing. We own it. This is our instrument for policy. This is our baby.
Maurice Strong has headed up the entire environmental program of the United Nations for decades and is the father of Agenda 21. He said, quote, Agenda 21 is a blueprint for constructing the new world order. It is vital people grasp this, unquote. He picked Gro Harlem Brundtland to write out the world's environmental agenda in a document titled Our Common Future, which is where the term sustainable development was used for the first time. Guess who she was? The former vice president of the World Socialist Party, the group that Karl Marx himself started. The icing on the cake is the next player I came across, Mikhail Gorbachev, the murderous communist dictator. Guess what he did immediately upon stepping down from the Soviet Union? He started an environmental group, Green Cross International.
You mentioned Gorbachev. He has no problem at all switching gears from the Soviet destroyer of the environment, come to America, he's the savior of the environment. But what's he promoting? Bigger government, more control, more power to the United Nations, less individual freedom, all of the agenda of collectivism. He's doing exactly the same thing in San Francisco that he was doing in Moscow.
And he isn't just some fringe player. He is one of the leaders. When I found out that the Earth Charter, which is supposed to be the new 10 Commandments for the 21st century, was written by Mr. Gorbachev, it was clear. Environmentalism isn't just like communism. It is communism. You couldn't make this stuff up.
A lot of the people in the peace movement were in fact more pro-Russia and anti-American than anything. And they brought their neo-Marxism with them into the environmental movement, pushing it to the extreme left of the political spectrum. Greenpeace and their allies and a whole bunch of other fellow travelers have adopted these agendas, which actually, if they were brought into effect, would cause more damage to people and the environment than if we just went about our sort of conventional way that we're on now.
In 1995, the Marxists, Democratic Socialists of America, 7,000 members, Gramsciist communists, they believe in revolution through infiltration, they took over the AFL-CIO. They took over the American Labour Movement, and they put their member, John Sweeney, in as president. And now their protege, Richard Trumka, runs it for them. What they did, they then took over every single major labour union in the country, and that leverage enabled them to take over the Democratic Party. Because there's hardly a Democrat at any level in this country, from county commission to federal, who doesn't owe his job to the unions for money, for manpower, for get out the vote, even for vote fraud. They mounted a purge at the higher levels of all the Southern Dixiecrats, the conservative Democrats, the moderate Democrats, and now the Marxists, through the unions, have completely taken over the higher reaches of the Democratic Party. So you've got 20,000 card-carrying communists in your country are dictating the policies of the Democratic Party, which is controlling the lives of 300 million Americans.
If this is hard to believe, I encourage you to go to the Communist Party USA's People's World or the Democratic Socialists of America's Democratic Left, and you will see every single issue they are promoting today will be the exact issues the Democrats will be putting on the floor of Congress tomorrow.
And you've got all these loyal Democrats out there, good patriotic people, who still think they're voting for Harry Truman and JFK. Look, by the standards of today, do you think Harry Truman or JFK would have a chance in today's Democratic Party? Those guys today would probably be in the Tea Party. Yet their party is now run by communists, and all these loyal Democrats all over this country are still voting on party lines and basically voting for Marxists and anti-Americans because they do not understand their party has been taken over.
It's no longer just an opposing party with different views. It is our enemy working as fast and furious as they can to finish the quiet revolution that started over 100 years ago. And that is why every issue is being used against us as a weapon to destroy.
So the process is simple. The Marxists set a policy. It might be socialisation of student loans, or green jobs, or cap and trade, or card check, or a New START treaty with Russia, or Obamacare, or immigration amnesty. They're behind the campaign to end fracking. They're behind the gutting of your military. They're behind the dumbing down of your schools and Common Core. All of these programs that are affecting every American every day is being orchestrated by small Marxist groups who have been able to take over the labour movement of this country, and by doing that they then took over the Democratic Party and are now running the country. They're effectively running the country.
I contend that sooner or later they will use violence. They'll use violence when they get to a certain percentage. If they can get 70% of the people behind them, they will wipe out their opposition, because the socialist communists cannot stand competition.
They have to take America down, then they can have world government, and the communists will then throw off their mask and they will have worldwide Leninism. That is their plan.
Like my pastor, he spent 5 years in prison. My cousin's husband, he spent 9 years in prison. He was a pastor. Because they say, no, you cannot worship in this way. You can worship to your God only as we say to you. So when government coming inside in our lifestyle, it's really bad for us. It's really bad. So
the Chinese has a system called re-education through labor. Any police officer can issue you a re-education through labor system that can make any Chinese citizen arbitrarily sent to a labor camp for up to 3 years without needing any due process at all.
My younger brother was 16 years old. He was politically active minor, 16-year-old. And they arrested him. This was in the 80s, early 80s, put him in jail. And they told my mom, who was visiting, don't worry, he's doing okay. We're going to release him. They kept him 2 years until he turned 18. And one day they called my mom, said, come and get his body. They killed him. And no reason, no court, why. He told me he's okay, he's making progress. And they charged my mom for the bullets that killed my brother. He said, we spent this much, you have to pay us to release his body. You have to pay for his execution.
Don't want to live this again, but I am living it. You know, every day is one more provision, one more thing that you cannot say. And I don't know.
It's no secret that totalitarianism resulted in the slaughter of hundreds of millions of people during the 20th century. But what most people don't realize is that the environmental movement is now setting the stage for the slaughter in this century of billions. Since humans have now been labeled the greatest enemy of Earth, and the planet has been elevated to God status through the resurrection of ancient paganism, things that were once unthinkable are now becoming thinkable. If you don't think there's a religious element to this, they have made an exact replica of the Ark of the Covenant from the Bible to carry Mr. Gorbachev's Earth Charter. And people literally are worshiping it, praying to it, and placing gifts before it. And if you think this new paganism won't include things like human sacrifice, think again. Just during the 8 years of Obama, the child sacrifice worldwide through abortion has exceeded 320 million babies, the entire population of the United States.
Under the new Agenda 21 movement, we've been demoted. We are now below the earth. And if we are less than the earth, then there is no tyranny against man that cannot be justified under the premise of protecting the environment.
Honest environmentalists will all tell you, well, a good number would be, no, we have 7 billion now. They won't say a billion. They'll say probably a few 100 million. Okay, then you ask them, how are we going to get to that number? How are we going to get to that number? And they look at you with a blank look. Because abortion and sterilization isn't going to get us there, so how are we going to get there? And then I will always ask them the question, You want a war? Will a war work for you? How about a plague? Will a plague work for you? How about starvation? Will starvation work for you? And you know, in the back of their mind, they're thinking all those things will work for them, because there's no way you're going to reduce that many people on the planet to get it to where they think it's sustainable. And of course, at the same time, they're thinking, and I'm going to be one of the chosen ones who will be allowed to live.
The odds are against us. We have seen the trends move in the direction to oppose the Christian faith, to oppose family, freedom. Socialism is on the rise. And I think people are intimidated by the giants. What we need are Davids who show up and say, who is this uncircumcised Philistine who should defy the armies of the living God? Who does this big guy think he is? And then you go and get your 5 stones and you launch one into the head of this thing. That's what we need.
It takes a certain commitment to not an election cycle, but an intergenerational commitment to ideals which, if implemented, can change society. We've seen it happen for the other side. We should expect nothing less than the same kind of time frame and the same kind of pledge. Only ours, I think, is more deeply. Our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. Honor fits in.
And the Republican Party has an establishment that has given us some losers for candidates. It's time for the grassroots to rise up and reassert itself.
Listen, as Christians, we have a spiritual, moral obligation to vote.
We have to go into political office. We have to network with each other. We have to dislodge these professional politicians and collectivists.
And there are people who think that the job of precinct committeeman is the most important.
We have to take back over the Republican Party. I attended my first county Republican meeting in May of 2006. Within a couple months, I was asked to be the precinct committeeman for my area because the position was empty. And then, only 11 months after I attended my first meeting, I received a call one morning from the governor asking me to be the new representative from my district. Did you know about 35% of the precinct committeeman positions are empty nationwide? We need to fill them with real conservatives and take the party back from the ground up. Number one, we need to bank locally at small independent banks so the money stays in our communities to make them stronger and more self-sufficient. Stop using the big banks. We are funding our own destruction with every dollar we give them. Number two, we need to get out of debt. This will make us economically stronger as individuals, which will make us stronger as a nation. Number three, be productive. Start new businesses. 100 years ago, 70% of Americans own their own business. Today, it is less than 20%. Fathers need to come home and start utilizing the incredible potential of their families in creative home businesses. Number four, mentor youth to be entrepreneurial. That is where the money is and true independence. It also eliminates the need to go to college, where we are losing all of our children. And number five, buy USA every time you can. It keeps the money home instead of funding our enemies. It provides jobs for Americans. And most importantly, it stops rewarding all the countries of the world that have enslaved their people for profit.
Well, I think the worst thing that a Christian can do today is send their children to these cesspools we call schools. They're not public schools, they're government-run schools. At the end of the day, the curriculum is secular humanism, and it conflicts with what that child may hear Sunday morning and Wednesday night at Bible study. So we set them in an environment of absolute confusion, and then they have no determinant for a right and wrong.
And this guarantees that a socialist, humanist, totalitarian approach to life will always emerge victorious, generation after generation after generation, until parents step in and say enough. until a few of us stand up and say, we're tired of losing. We're not going to play this anymore.
And the only way you're going to reverse the trends is if you start interjecting a biblical worldview back into the hearts and minds of our youth.
The Bible says to bring them up under the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The scriptures tell us that we'll give an account for everything, especially for the stewardship of our children.
It is a father's responsibility to make sure each of his children understand the world around them, so they aren't deceived by every clever-sounding lie that comes along.
And I think the direction we ought to move as a culture is to the point where we essentially disband the entire educational infrastructure. And if we're going to collect tax dollars for education, then we say to parents, here are the education dollars that we have devoted to your students' education. It's yours. So if you want to enroll your child in a homeschool, if you would like to enroll your child in a private Christian school, education dollars follow the student to the school of the parent's choice.
All efforts to reform education should be focused on one task: implementing a voucher system to break the government's stronghold. This would eliminate virtually overnight Common Core, failing schools, the promotion of immorality, the environmental propaganda, and the anti-Americanism, which is now the bedrock of the K-12 program. We can no longer sacrifice our children on the altar of convenience. Number one, we need to demand of our representatives that they stop the UN from putting all displaced Muslims worldwide in America.
You know, there's 56 or 57 countries that make up the Islamic Conference. If you've got a Muslim in one Muslim country that needs a place of refuge, they've got 56 other places where they ought to be able to go.
Number two, we must be sharing the gospel with those who are already here in America, praying that they will get saved and go from being a threat to us to our brothers and sisters in Christ.
If you want to reach out to Muslims in America, reach them early and reach them with love. In Islam, there is no love. That's the weak point of Islam. If you want to invade Islam, that's their weak point. Because Allah in Islam has 99 names and not one is love. There is no commandment to love and forgive one another. So when you love people and you love one another and you love God, you are piercing the darkness of Islam in a major way.
Number one, we need to expose the lies. Everything they preach is a lie. America is the cleanest country in the world and always will be, as long as we are free. We have cut our pollution in half since the 1970s, even though our population has almost doubled. We aren't the problem. We are the solution. Number two, hound federal officials to get us out of the United Nations. The world's entire environmental agenda is seeping out of this Marxist cesspool. We need to abort its influence in America before it's too late. Number three, get involved in protecting private property rights at the local level. Work to remove from office anyone that doesn't offensively fight for property rights. If you don't have property rights, you don't have any rights at all. Property owners have a proven record of knowing what is best for their land far better than any government ever has.
Some of the signs to look for to discern as to whether or not you are in an apostate church. It's important to see, is a pastor preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ crucified on the cross for our sins, buried, resurrected again? Is he preaching the message of the gospel and eternal judgment, and the fact that we don't live very long on this earth and we're going to stand before God and give an account as to whether or not we've embraced the grace of God through Christ Jesus? Is he preaching repentance, that you must turn from sin and embrace Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior? If you don't see that in a fellowship and there's another agenda afoot, I would say, run and don't walk to the nearest exit.
We need those of you that are pastors to stand up and lead and only be concerned about one thing. What does God think about what you're doing? And we need those of you that are Christians to share the gospel faithfully Most under 30 in America have never even heard the truth about Jesus. 67% of non-Christians have never even been invited to church. This is unacceptable. The complete transformation that takes place with salvation is the only real hope for America.
I think it begins right at home, in your own heart, in your own mind. Reform takes place there, and then it begins to work its way out. The multiplication which occurred, the revolution which occurred in the first century, was a revolution of individuals' hearts. And you began to see this mushroom effect that took place in individual homes only because individuals were changed. And then communities changed. And then the world was radically altered for the good as a result.
I think the day of the sunshine patriot and the fair weather Christian are coming to an end. We're going to have to pick what side we are on. And there's not 10 different options. There's only 2. We will either be on God's side, living a pure life, standing for His laws, regardless of the cost, or we will be on man's side, which means we are the enemy of God. And the reality is, these evil people and groups that have just dismantled this country over the last 100 years, they have done that while an all-powerful, holy God has been sitting on His throne. What does that mean? It means He has allowed that to happen. That's what should drop us to our knees in fear. Why would a holy God that hates what these people are doing far worse than we do, why would He allow them to flourish and succeed in their plans? Well, I think if each one of us looks inside of our own heart, on our knees before God, and says, God, what have I done that has caused you to remove your hand of blessing from our country? I know we've all done things that have contributed to the problems that we face. If we repent, if each of us individually comes before God and makes things right, and then makes a firm decision to go in the opposite direction and change things, I know He will bless our efforts. I know He will give us back our country, because that's who He is. He is long-suffering. He loves His people. He loves truth and righteousness, and He hates what is evil. I ask you to join with me and my family and commit to pray for our country, for our children and grandchildren, for the generations that are to come, that we will do everything in our power to turn them back to God's Word, to His principles, to His way of doing things, which always brings blessing. And I think as He sees that repentance, He sees that true desire to love Him with all our heart, mind, and strength, He will step in and crush our enemies, the ones that right now seem to be in control of almost everything. Just like I told my children at the festival, God does answer prayers. He can save our country.
There's nothing that is lost that cannot be found by the power of God. There's nothing that is hurtling through the abyss that cannot grow wings and soar to the heavens by the power of God. You shall mount up on wings like eagles. You shall run and not be weary. And I think that that's true of our country. And in our case, we won't be discovering something or finding out, we'll be rediscovering. We won't have to wander about in foul and distant places. We just have to go home. We have to go home to the heart of faith. We have to go home to the true spirit of liberty. We have to go home to that reverent love of God which triumphs over every fear. And we'll find America again. Isn't that beautiful? You come home to God, and there you will find America. And that's what we've got to do now. And that's why I'm optimistic, because God can save our country, but He won't until we ask.